The 14th of January 2021, the New Zealand government has approved an exception class for 1,000 international tertiary students, degree level and above, who began their study in New Zealand but were caught offshore when the border restriction began due to COVID-19. And this exception will allow students to return to New Zealand in stages from April 2021. We're going to dive into that together right now. Alright guys, so let me begin by telling you that we are mostly a travel channel here. We're not an immigration channel, and we're not a channel here to discuss like studying in New Zealand. But since the announcement was made literally only a few hours ago, we received thousands and thousands of emails, maybe not thousands, but tens and tens of emails and messages and comments from people asking us to address this. And because we know that there is a lot of people that want to come and study in New Zealand as well as discover the whole country, we decided to go a little bit over what this new announcement is. The first thing that I would like to point out is that I'm doing this video really off the cuff. This is an announcement that just happened right now, and I want to make sure that everybody is aware that there is a lot of more information that is needed to be released in order for us to have a full picture of what will happen. So I'm sharing with you guys my screen right now in which the announcement is, and the first thing that I would like to talk about is where this announcement is from. So this announcement comes from beehive.govt.nz, which is the website from the New Zealand government. It's really important for you guys to take your information from official sources. So if the address of the website does not finish with govt.nz, so for example it can be immigration.govt.nz or beehive.govt.nz or the Ministry of Education, make sure that you take the information with a grain of salt. If it comes with the source of govt.nz, then at that point that means that they actually are real official sources. Alright, so let's go over what the announcement entails and what it was all about. I'm just going to make sure that you guys always have on screen what I'm going to be reading. So this announcement comes from the Honourable Chris Hipkins, which is the Minister of Education here in New Zealand. He's also the Ministry of Health, just as a side note. So this announcement is the border exception for some returning international tertiary students. So during this whole press release right here is going to cover some context on why there is an exception, as well as why is the exception so strict, and also we're going to go over some of the requirements for people to be able to get into this exception. Again, there is only 1,000 spots, so that's very limited amount, and the restrictions are actually quite tough. So make sure that you stick until the end of the video when we're going to go over all the restrictions, and we'll go over that together. Alright, so as I said during my introduction, the New Zealand government has approved an exception class for 1,000 international tertiary students, degree level and above, who began their study in New Zealand but were caught offshore when the border restriction began. The exception will allow students to return to New Zealand in stages from April 2021. So the first quote from Minister Chris Hipkins is, "Our top priority continue to be the health and safety and well-being of all people in New Zealand. The need to carefully manage our borders is as critical now as at any time in the past 9 months. We continue to learn more about the virus and adapt accordingly with stronger and more tailored border protection depending on risk. Within our safety first framework, we also have a responsibility to carefully balance our decision to support New Zealand's economic recovery." So this is to point out that yes, they want to keep Kiwis safe in New Zealand, of course, and Kiwis are New Zealanders, but they also need to keep the New Zealand economy going, and we'll see that a little bit later during this press release. Students coming to New Zealand is a big part of New Zealand economy. So for this reason, they want to make sure that there is availability for students to come to New Zealand. Alright, so he continues to say that this border exception delivers on part of the recovery plan for international education. It underscores the government's commitment to the international education sector, which is important to the country's long-term economic recovery from COVID-19. So basically that says that New Zealand's economic recovery is not going to happen just like that overnight. We are still going to be needing some students to come and spend some money in New Zealand, but also stay and settle in New Zealand and provide value to the New Zealand economy in the long term. He continues by saying that the students will return to New Zealand in phases, beginning with a cohort of 300 that will be able to return from April, with the remaining students returning throughout the year as the quarantine availability allows. So that means that in April you're only going to have only 300 spots for students to come to New Zealand, and after that it will depend on what is available in the limited amount of beds available in quarantines, because students coming back to New Zealand will still have to stay within the quarantine facilities of New Zealand for 14 days. Those quarantine restrictions still apply to anyone coming to New Zealand. The return of these students will not affect the availability of Kiwis to return home, and it is balanced against the requirement for skilled worker to enter the country. So same thing, you have a certain amount of spots which are available for Kiwis to return to New Zealand, and there is a certain amount of spots for skilled workers to come to New Zealand, and the students will basically be working with with the spots that are available for skilled workers. He continues to say that they will be subject to the same border rules and quarantine regime as other arrivals, with any additional restrictions depending on where they come from. So any rules right now still apply for any of the requirements. Then he gets into details on what that will entail and how students will actually be able to apply for coming to New Zealand. He say they will need to book their space through the allocation system, that's for the quarantine, and will be billed the standard charge for managed isolation. At the moment is around 3,100 New Zealand dollars. They also need to be able to do more to support themselves in New Zealand, with the living expenses that are required for international students to be granted a visa now raised to 20,000 New Zealand dollars, up from 15,000 New Zealand dollars. So before, when you were coming to New Zealand to study, you needed to have a certain amount of funds available to support yourself while in New Zealand, and that was 15,000 New Zealand dollars. Now it's 20,000 New Zealand dollars. He continues in saying that the system allows providers to welcome back students who have made the greatest commitment to New Zealand and manage pressure on the quarantine system. So that means that basically some education providers in New Zealand are struggling because they do not have any international students there, so that gives them a little bit of breathing room so they can get some more students and get some fees coming in, but also that doesn't push the quarantine facilities to the brink by just overflowing with thousands and thousands of students coming in. Alright, so he continues in saying that the government remains committed to working with the international education sector to ensure options for the broader return of international students to be considered, and that opportunities can be taken as and when it is safe and there is capacity to do so. So that means that right now that's the current idea that they have to get more people coming to New Zealand. That's the one system that they're going to be using with this 1,000 spot, but they leave the door open into increasing that or reducing that depending on what the situation entails. And then finally he concludes by saying that the annual economic value of this group, so that's the 1,000 degree level international students, is estimated to be roughly 49 million New Zealand dollars in the wider economic contribution, including about approximately 27 million in tuition fees. So that's an average of $27,000 of fee per student, in the New Zealand economy. That's kind of roughly what it says. All right, so let's go over the details of those border exceptions. So right here we have them on screen. So the student with questions about this border exception should contact their provider. So you need to contact your school as well as your immigration advisor. The Ministry of Education will continue to work with tertiary education providers to manage this process. The eligibility are as follows. You need to hold or have already held a student visa in 2020. So either you currently hold a student visa which is still valid, or you had one in 2020. You also need to be studying toward a bachelor's degree level or above qualification. Anything below will not be eligible for this border exception just yet. You also need to have studied in New Zealand in 2019 or in 2020 toward your current qualification. If you were doing another qualification in 2020 or 2019, that doesn't apply. If it's toward this current qualification for your current visa, then that will apply. You also need to be returning to study with your current provider, so you can be switching around or changing your studies or anything like that. And lastly, you need to be in country to complete your study. So if there is an option for you to do that online, then at that point you don't qualify for this exception, and they will kind of prioritize only people which absolutely need to be in New Zealand to do this. Finally, the priorities will be given to the students which are the closest to graduation. So if you literally just got started into your study process in New Zealand, you may just not be able to qualify for this. Alright, so that's basically everything we have for you guys at this stage. Again, we are mostly a travel channel here. We're here to tell you about all the things that there is to do in New Zealand, but I do know that a lot of you guys are very stressed about this situation, so I just thought I'd do a quick video to cover this subject right here. I will leave some extra predictions below with all the predictions that we currently have for when will the New Zealand border open more widely. Our current predictions are for November or December 2021 at the earliest, and probably in 2022, but there's much more detail in the video that I'm going to link below, and even at the end of this video there's going to be a card in which you can click and learn more. In the meantime, for anything traveling in New Zealand, make sure to stick around and hitting like and subscribe. We keep you informed about some of the subject from time to time, but we're mostly a travel channel. Keep being awesome, stay safe out there, and thank you very much for watching.